Good afternoon. We have some questions have come in. I hope you're all finding the retreat beneficial. I know from the questions some people are struggling with their mind, but that's totally normal. You would be a rare person who meditates and has no distractions, no sleepiness, no loss of enthusiasm sometimes. These are very normal things, and also physical difficulties. Some people have got coughs and colds like me, some people have aches and pains, all kinds of things. These are all normal, just part of our human existence. First question. Respects to Ajahn. May I know what is true inner renunciation and dispassion? Are they identical? Am I understanding it correctly that true renunciation will be a feeling of happiness and inner peace from within, the here and now, and not attached towards any sense pleasures, even if one is in the process of sense pleasure with family friends? In a way, a true renunciation starts when one will not hold grudges, even though they are aware of their attachments and feelings but do not react to it. They see it arise and cease due to conditions. Thank you for your guidance. In the beginning, renunciation is an intention of mind. Nekama sankappa. The intention to renounce, to let go of attachments, and particularly to the senses. And the senses are our doorways for contacting the world, and as you're probably aware, we're always seeking sense pleasure, smaller and greater. Especially when you meditate and you're feeling kind of dull and bored. Sometimes we just have the feeling anything will do. Any thought, any interesting sense contact will do, because we're feeling so unstimulated. As we have more, then of course sense desire and desire for sense objects kind of develops, doesn't it? So it gets more refined the more choice you have, the more access you have to different kinds of sense pleasure. But in the beginning we develop the intention we develop the intention to renounce, based partly just on what we've heard and thought about, right view that we gain from teachers, thinking things through, noticing, observing our life. We notice that sense pleasures are very fleeting, temporary. They don't last, and we invest a lot of time chasing after them, finding the means to gain more sense pleasure and different sensory experience, and maybe seeing the suffering in that. So perhaps having had it pointed out to us by a teacher or the Buddha, having thought it through, then we are looking for something better more satisfactory, more lasting, more permanent. So that may be the beginning of the intention to renounce. But the best way to kind of solidify or make this intention grow into something that's part of the path of practice is to meditate. When you meditate, you're practicing renunciation, aren't you? You're putting attention on the breath, for example. That means you're letting go of everything else. You're not, at that moment, when you're meditating on the breath, you're not seeking out sight, sound, taste, smell, touch, and their objects. And you'll notice when you become more calm, when mindfulness stays with an object, whether it's the breath or any other meditation object, you start to gain inner stillness, happiness, that even more shows you don't need sense objects to be happy. Kind of gives you a reflection, a comparison. You can say, oh, this inner happiness is more satisfying to the mind than the more fleeting sense objects of the world. And it's inner, so it's free, it's something you can access and experience as much as you want through the practice. So it gives you a new perspective, a new attitude. That develops even more when you investigate, develop insight into the three characteristics of anicca, dukkha, anatta, impermanence, unsatisfactoriness, not self. All these sense objects ultimately are impermanent, they're unsatisfactory, they're not a self. You can't own them, keep them, have them. We waste a lot of time seeking out the objects of the senses and the pleasures of this world. And ultimately when you die, you can't take any of it with you, and even before you die, just on a day-to-day basis, none of it lasts. So as you meditate, you become more and more aware of that, and insight develops into the fleeting, impermanent nature of tastes, touch, smell, sights, sounds, and so on. So first of all, we renounce, we let go through intention and in training in mindfulness, right effort, and so on. Seeing the suffering that sense objects bring us when we get lost in them, caught up in desires for them, the attachments. But later, as insight and wisdom develops, the mind just naturally wants to put things down. You might say too much of a good thing. Sense objects are seen as so limited that they just can't bring you lasting happiness. So your whole view, the way of looking at the world changes. And the sense of ownership changes. You don't feel you own these sense objects anyway. The pleasures that you can have in this world, you realize you don't own. So then the mind turns away. So you get more dispassion, disenchantment, letting go, relinquishment. So these come through clear knowledge and vision of the way things are. Why do you keep chasing after something that can't satisfy you? Why bother? The mind is like that. It tires or turns away or tires of attaching to the objects of the senses. But like you say, we're still surrounded by the world. As long as we have a human body, we're sensitive, we have senses. We're not going to get rid of sense contact and sense objects. But what changes is your view, the way the mind relates to these things. And we no longer want to, the more we contemplate, we no longer want to crave and run after these things. The wanting is what changes. We start to get tired of the wanting and the reacting. And that also helps us to be free from a lot of aversion, because a lot of our aversion is based on not getting what we want. So just as we crave pleasant sights, beautiful sights, things we want to see, things that we like, when we don't get what we want, we don't see those things, or those things are taken away from us in some way, we get aversion. So our senses are constantly stimulating craving for and against, liking and disliking. But as you establish mindfulness and maintain mindfulness and can investigate, your mind doesn't want this endless liking and disliking. It goes to a higher place, you might say, or matures, and the letting go becomes much more natural. So ultimately it's wisdom that leads to renunciation, dispassion, turning away, and maybe through the practice get to the point where the mind takes more satisfaction in focusing on the unconditioned, the mind that is not craving anything, the mind that is still without wanting, without craving, the mind that is dispassionate towards things. It's a better state of mind. There's equanimity, there's stillness. It's, we would say, the highest happiness. One focuses more on that and turning away from endlessly craving the objects of the senses. So renunciation just becomes a natural mode or function of the mind through the practice. In the beginning, you say you're living at home, like you say, you're surrounded by family. There'll be moments of it. If you meditate regularly, there'll be moments when you get tired of social activities and going shopping and food, dinner parties, and all the things we do as lay people. There'll be moments, at least, probably, where you tire of that, and you realise it's sort of kind of pointless. You don't need to keep running after these so-called pleasurable experiences. And that can be a little bit of a problem, because you may be out of sync with the rest of your family who if they don't meditate and don't understand the Buddhist path, then they're wondering why you're not that interested in going to social events, listening to music, creating great feasts for dinner parties or whatever it is that people do. They may not understand why you're less interested in that. So you have to be very patient with that and compassionate to the people around you, and accept there'll be this little mismatch while you're living with people who don't practice. But if you associate with fellow meditators, come to monasteries or Buddhist centres and places where people do practice, you might find kindred spirits and you can engage in more other kinds of activities that support your practice. Going for walks in the countryside or something, whatever it may be. Dear Ajahn, do you have any advice for an individual who has the tendency to cling on to the Dharma? To me, it seems like it's wholesome. You have chanda, it's wholesome desire, but not wholesome as Dhamma should be practiced 24/7 and not to be attached to attending classes and Dhamma talks as well as attending retreats, right? Eventually I will need to let go of the Dhamma when I have crossed over another path. How can I learn to let go of the Dhamma and be the Dhamma in the here and now? Well, in the beginning it's probably okay to cling to the Dhamma. We cling to the Buddha, cling to the Dhamma, cling to the Sangha, cling to a teacher, because the alternative is clinging to the world. So I would rather cling to the suttas or the idea of the Buddha and the recollection of the Buddha or meditation retreats or a meditation technique than to cling to endlessly pursuing pleasures, as we were just discussing, entertainments and worldly success, simply success in one's job, one's career, various kinds of personal satisfaction, which I'm not putting down, I'm just saying they're very limited. I'd rather cling to the Dhamma to start with. And you have to accept, as you're practicing stepping away from the world towards Nibbana, the unconditioned, well, you've got to cling to something first. You need the raft to take you across the ocean of samsara. You get to the other side, you don't need the raft, but while you're on the ocean, you still need the raft, don't you? You don't throw the raft out too quickly, otherwise you drown. So it's okay to cling to some of the externals of the practice to start with. Keeping precepts, doing meditation retreats, reading the texts, listening to Dhamma talks, going on retreats, all the sort of external activities, the structure of the religion, some of the religious practices and so on. To start with, you may cling to that, but try to use it skillfully. So you might say, well, I still need to go on retreat, because if I don't go on retreat, I'll be more lazy in my meditation perhaps. We use a retreat situation to improve our effort, focus our minds, and it helps when you meditate with others in a more structured and disciplined situation perhaps. You may read a text and you may consider the words of that text, that teaching, or you hear a Dhamma talk, and at first you really cling to the words. You try and remember them and try and use them. But that's a means to an end, meaning the idea is to bring the words or the information or the wisdom you've gained and then bring it inside. Reflect until you see and know for yourself. Then you may, you can drop the words, as it were, because now you're observing and knowing the Dhamma for yourself. That is the goal, but you won't necessarily be able to achieve that quickly. You may have to rely on the talks and the externals of the practice first until your mind has matured and your insight is clearer and you're more reliable. You can rely on your own innate qualities that you've developed through the practice. So, you rely on meditation retreats until you're skilled in practicing and developing states of samadhi, say. That may take time, may take many years. So there's nothing wrong with going on a meditation retreat if you find it useful. In the end, you've got to look at the results of what you're doing. And so, true, it can become a cause of suffering. If you attach too much to the Dhamma, certain ideas of Dhamma, techniques, some of the external aspects of the Dhamma, well, yes, it can become a cause of suffering, and then you have to contemplate that and see where you're grasping too tightly. So if you grasp to your ideal of being a Buddhist, keeping the precepts, meditating, learning the Dhamma, and you have your views on the Dhamma, you attach so tightly that when someone else expresses a different view or practices slightly differently from you, that you get annoyed with them or criticize them or go into various unwholesome mental states. And that's a sign that you are clinging in some way. So you have to look at the results of what's going on. But in the beginning, maybe you need all these things to help you. So don't be too quick to dismiss them, I would say. And yeah, of course, we're aiming to be practicing the Dhamma 24/7. But we also have to accept there'll be big blanks in the mind when we're not very mindful, when we lose our way, when we forget, when we get distracted by more worldly pursuits. That will happen. But just like in one meditation session, when your mind strays away from your object, bring it back. If in your life you're noticing you're straying away from the Dhamma, you're no longer reflecting on Dhamma, you don't have much interest in the Dhamma, you don't listen to talk, you don't do any meditation, you don't pursue the Dhamma as such. Well, when you realize that, perhaps that's the time to step back and say, how can I bring more Dhamma into my life? And you just keep going the best you can. Maybe there'll be a natural progression. If you keep practicing the Dhamma, you may reach a point when you can, if you're fortunate, maybe you can retire and dedicate yourself to the Dhamma practice in one way or another much more wholeheartedly. But until that point, you may also have to depend on the world as well. So you may have to, have your job, do your job, look after a family, and so you try and practice the Dhamma as you do these other activities as well, and you'll have to learn how to balance that. Dear Ajahn, I lose Dhamma inspiration very easily. I know it is good for me to practice more and not to waste this human birth I have. But I can't even maintain a daily meditation. I make determinations to start practicing every day, but I fail very often. When I'm in a monastery, it is so easy for me to meditate and to maintain mindfulness through the day. But when I am back at home and work, I get dragged into the sensual world so easily. May you please advise on how to keep the practice up. Well, when you're practicing in the lay life, I would make it clear what parts of the practice are essential and cannot be given up or abandoned, and what parts are maybe more for when you have more time, more energy available, then you pursue them. So like what parts of the practice shouldn't be abandoned? 5 precepts. You may be busy at work, you may have family commitments. I would try and make a commitment every day to keep the 5 precepts. If you've been doing that long enough, you probably won't even need to make a resolution or anything. It's just natural. But in the beginning, you may have to mentally aspire to keep the 5 precepts every morning, say. That would be a good start. You may take refuge in Buddha, Dhamma, Sangha as you do that. So you remind yourself of the Buddha, take refuge in the Buddha as your teacher, the Dhamma, the way of practice leading to the truth, and then the Sangha, those enlightened individuals who have realized the Dhamma. You remind yourself of them as your goals, your guiding inspiration in your life. This much, you might say, is an essential thing. And then if you are somebody who's busy, scattered, sometimes unenthusiastic for the Dhamma, just see what is the minimum practice of, say, meditation you could keep up in a day. I would recommend 10 minutes minimum. If you wake up and you clear some time before you've got other things to do in your day, do 10 minutes of meditation, just learning to sit quietly, whatever you feel like. You feel strong, you feel weak, tired, energetic, inspired, uninspired. Just get used to practicing for 10 minutes every morning. Such as, and pick up meditations such as mindfulness of breathing or developing loving kindness, and do that every day. Because 10 minutes is not very long, so even if you're feeling tired, you should be able to do 10 minutes. So the 5 precepts, 10 minutes of meditation, taking refuge in Buddha, Dhamma, Sangha. I'd say those are essential. And these will set up your mind for the rest of the day. You may not do any more meditation. You may kind of forget all about the Dhamma as you go to work, do things. But they're like little seeds that are in your consciousness now that your mind can return to and will help guide you when you have to make choices as things come up in your day where you may, your precepts may be challenged and you're tempted to break a precept, say you're having committed to them earlier in the day, then you might find you can keep your precept more strongly. So I'd say that's an essential kind of beginner's level of practice that you need to commit to. Then you just see what more you can do. Sometimes you feel more enthusiastic, you've got more time. Well, go on a retreat or sit meditation for longer, do various activities that support the Dhamma practice, acts of charity, generosity, helping people, family, friends, going out and doing voluntary work, generosity in different ways. Just see what you can do that brings you some joy, but also is helpful for the people around you, the society, and supports your Dhamma practice. But how much you do depends, doesn't it, on your situation. I would get into the habit of doing things, at least small acts of practice, like 10 minutes of meditation. Get into the habit of doing that every day. You'll find that helpful. Dear Ajahn, I have some fears about the meditation practice. After experiencing some involuntary head movement and some strange sensations like electric shocks during meditation, what should I do? In the beginning of meditation, it's quite common for us to have physical reactions, unusual sensations that we haven't noticed before. Sometimes pain, sometimes just strange things that we pick up on because we're now becoming more mindful of the body. So a very common one is people feel their heart beating, or the breath. As they're focusing on the breath, they become agitated with the sensations associated with the movement of the breath. Some people notice, air coming in and out of their ears, or air moving around the body. All kinds of little things which some people find annoying or distracting. Or, as you say, sometimes involuntary movements. So some people, when they're meditating, they're not yet very peaceful, but they're putting their effort into being mindful of an object, like the breath, for example. Every time the mind moves away from the breath, they get like an involuntary physical movement. So they move their hand, move their head, move the body in some way. Sometimes that can be quite fast movement, sometimes quite strong, intense movement. Simply becoming because they've been concentrating and then they lose their concentration and they get a physical expression of that. It can happen. Some people have just strange karma and they're meditating and, like you say, involuntary movements just seem to come out of nowhere. So you have to be very patient, especially in the beginning. You'll get a lot of this in the beginning, but if you keep meditating, most people find these sort of things start to settle down and no longer arise or no longer bother the meditator, and after a while it's just not an issue. But you have to be patient enough to get to that point through the practice. Same with the mind, people get visions and stuff coming up in their mind once they start meditating. Sometimes it's more physical movements, painful sensations. One common one is when people start to meditate, they get these pains in different parts of their body. When they're not meditating, they don't feel it. They're just sitting there at a computer or sitting in a car or just walking along doing something, nothing, no pain, no problem. But as soon as they start to meditate, there's a pain in the back, a pain in the knee, pain here, pain there, headaches. And it kind of is off-putting, as you would imagine, because if they're not meditating, they feel fine. When they're meditating, they start to feel pain. So you associate meditation with pain, so then you don't want to meditate, which is understandable. But what it is karma from the past coming up. And it's a strange thing, but when you're putting more effort in to develop wholesome states of mind, practicing mindfulness, learning to put effort into your meditation, letting go of negative states of mind, developing insight into impermanence and so on. These are very wholesome activities. Wholesome states of mind are arising, but it's almost like your old karma comes up to block or obstruct the good that you're trying to do. What we call obstructive karma. And it's because we've done things that have obstructed ourselves or other people in the past, I guess. We've hurt others in one way or another. We've clung on to more negative mental states in the past. So just as we're trying to do something good, like meditate, this stuff arises seemingly out of nowhere, but it's actually old karma. So a very common one is in a past life or even in this life, we've hurt animals. So people who have, when they were young, they killed frogs, they killed fish, they killed this, killed that. When they start to meditate, some of that karma comes back as different painful sensations throughout the body. If they keep meditating, often the pain gradually subsides, disappears, and they're beyond it. It's like that karma has given its result and it's finished. But sometimes it drags on, unfortunately, if it's very strong karma. And there's no obvious cause. They're not ill, they're not injured, and yet they experience these painful sensations. And that's often because of old karma. So sometimes I quote people who have had to, when they were younger, they had to kill animals. So like one lady, rice farmers in Thailand, they have a problem with freshwater crabs eating their crops. So they break the legs off the crabs to stop them climbing up and eating the rice, or eating the young rice plants, eating the ears of the rice. So they break the legs of the crabs. They don't even kill them. It's like torture. They just break the legs and then dump them. They can't move and they die a slow, horrible death. So one lady was constantly getting leg pains when she meditated and visions of crabs that she had killed previously. When she didn't meditate, she didn't feel the pain. So only when she meditated. Other people similarly they've killed fish, they've killed chickens, they've killed things, and as soon as they start meditating they get various physical pain and sensations. Somebody was killing fish, so every time they meditated they had this terrible intense stingy heat feeling coming up. Seemed to be associated with the fish they had killed. So some of it is karma from the past, and you just have to be patient with it until it wears out. It's obstructive karma. Dear Ajahn, many thanks for making time to guide us these few days, even though you are unwell. Wishing you a speedy recovery from your cough. It'd be good if I recovered from my cough, because then I wouldn't have to cough into the microphone and disturb you all. Anyway, may I know what could be the underlying cause if there are moments of arising thoughts of unwholesome actions towards the triple gem, Buddha, Dhamma, Sangha, even if I did not think about it. The thoughts come up by themselves. The thoughts are really unwholesome. I'm learning not to give it any attention, and I feel guilty for having such thoughts. Could this be a cause for my hindrances in progressing in the Dhamma, as I have disrespected the Triple Gem in my past life before? This is not so uncommon as you might think. Many people describe such a phenomena. They have great faith in Buddha, Dhamma, Sangha normally. They're practicing Buddhism. They believe in the Buddha's enlightenment. They believe it's a good thing to do. They're training their mind in meditation, and then they notice sometimes they have resistance or even destructive thoughts. One man came here and said he was always having abusive thoughts towards Buddha, Dhamma, Sangha. He said very nasty, abusive thoughts. And these kind of thoughts seem to come up out of nowhere. You're sitting down to meditate, you're not intending to be disrespectful or have thoughts, of aversion towards Buddha, Dhamma, Sangha, and yet they pop up into the mind. So again, where are they coming from? Well, it's karma, isn't it? You must have been thinking like that before. If you're not sitting down with that intention now, it must be previous intentions are now filtering up into your consciousness. Like you say, if you don't pay attention to them, you are aware that they're happening, but then you consciously let them go. You don't indulge them, and they're going to fade away because you're not feeding and supporting them. They may be disappointing, and like you say, you feel bad, but try not to hold on to that feeling of disappointment or guilt. Just accept, well, in previous times you may have, for whatever reason, harboured unskillful thoughts towards Buddha, Dhamma, Sangha. Now it's time to let them go and keep that attitude of acknowledging, being mindful of them, and then letting them go. And eventually they're not going to come up if you don't add on to them or hold on to them. Sometimes our own mind, because it is still defiled, there's still a sense of self, attachment to the different unskillful states of mind rooted in greed, anger, delusion. Sometimes the purity of Buddha, Dhamma, Sangha, the goodness, the clarity of wisdom, the compassion, all the good qualities of Buddha, Dhamma, Sangha kind of challenge our defilements. Because we know our defilements are a source of suffering and there's something to be abandoned. It's as if a part of the self fights back or resists the Buddha, Dhamma, Sangha. So it may not be any particular person. It could be a person who represents Buddha, Dhamma, Sangha. It could be a monk or someone like that. Or it may just be the idea of Buddha, Dhamma, Sangha. Challenges your defilements, so your defilements want to fight back. It's a bit like, a teenage kid who's rebellious, and the parents are telling them something very wise or truthful or useful, but they don't want to hear it, and they're rude and insulting and argumentative with their parents. It's that kind of thing. Part of our mind can argue with the Dhamma, with the Buddha, the Dhamma, the Sangha. It's just coming from a sense of self, coming from delusion. So if you recognize that, you see it or observe it, or don't feed it, don't make it stronger, let it go. And you just have to accept that's part of the way the defilements operate. It can be rooted in conceit, self-view, and part of us, some people have a lot of self-confidence, pride, and then if they hear the Dhamma or they think of something that represents the Dhamma, like the Buddha, it's like, why should I have to listen to the Buddha? Why should I accept what the Buddha says? Who's the Buddha to tell me? Or who's this monk to tell me? We can resist Buddha Dhamma Sangha, or the truth that Buddha Dhamma Sangha represents, with our own ego, our own conceit, views, opinions, sense of self. And so in the mind there's a resistance. Even if we're not doing it now, it may have happened in the past. And so now we are observing the results of that, is that it comes up again as a fresh cycle of thought formations, intentions, seemingly from nowhere. But it's not from nowhere, it's a process of cause and effect that's come to this moment, so it's arising now. So have patience for yourself and kindness, but be also at the same time be strict and say, I'm not going to indulge these thoughts. These are very unwholesome, unskillful thoughts. So don't feed them, don't make them any stronger than they are already. And if you keep ignoring them, meaning not feeding them, you keep consciously letting them go, then after a while they should stop. Dear Venerable Ajahn, thank you for considering this. If it seems inappropriate to respond, there is certainly no offence or concern. In the Paticca Samuppada, avijja may seem to imply a supermundane mind without any self or aham that independently pre-exists. The arising of causality, e.g. the current causal continuum, possibly in the same sense that nibbana is not the result of any causal chain. If not implied, then, from what does avijja originate or depend on? Or, discarding everything else, and with awareness of anicca and anatta, how should a student of Buddha Gautama's Dhamma, as presented in the Nikayas, proceed? Apologies if this sounds like a silly Zen question or metaphysical nonsense. Perhaps there are no useful, beneficial answers. Well, the Paticca Samuppada is this teaching at the centre of the Buddhist teachings on, we call it dependent arising or dependent co-arising. The Buddha's explanation of the causal links that lead to the arising of suffering. But then he also teaches how to abandon suffering, so the whole thing in reverse, as it were. So it is central to helping to explain where suffering comes from, using the wisdom of the Buddha. And as you noted at the beginning, the first cause in the whole link is avijja, ignorance. You might say ignorance of what? Ignorance of the Four Noble Truths. So as long as we don't understand and practice according to the Four Noble Truths, we're bound up by ignorance. The Arahant has penetrated the Four Noble Truths, so they're no longer affected by ignorance. But the unenlightened person is. You can say, well, where does ignorance come from? What's the starting point? Well, remember this teaching on dependent co-arising, it's not linear, it's a circle, as it were, it's cyclical. And because we are not mindful, we give in to craving and attachment, which are parts of this cycle. Craving and attachment stimulate more ignorance. So it's back to square one all the time, every moment of every day. As long as we're not mindful and aware, our mind keeps going back to ignorance and creating more ignorance, conditioning more ignorance, which conditions more craving, more attachment, which conditions more ignorance. So unless we interrupt that cycle through developing the practice of mindfulness, insight, letting go of craving, letting go of attachment, letting go of becoming, the cycle will keep spinning and keep reinforcing itself and get worse. Our suffering will get worse. So suffering depends on craving and attachment. How does it manifest? Well, as you meditate, you'll notice the 5 hindrances coming up into your mind. Sense desire, ill will, sloth, torpor, drowsiness, restlessness and agitation, anxiety, and skeptical doubt. 5 hindrances. Every time we give in to the hindrances, which is a lot of the time, they are feeding more avijja. And avijja feeds more hindrances. The hindrances are the manifestation of craving and attachment. Just for ease of study as we're learning and meditating, we talk about the 5 hindrances, but in short they're craving and attachment arising based on avijja. So in brief, for example, how do the hindrances arise? Well, you see something that you like the look of, draws out your desire, craving to see more of that, to intensify that pleasurable experience, that moment of pleasure, seeing the thing you like. And sense desire is born and stimulated and it may be intensified. But if we have a moment of mindfulness, then we bring up the mindfulness, we say, okay, this is a pleasurable object, but we drop the craving at that moment. We don't indulge the pleasure, we don't indulge the craving for the pleasure, we don't feed attachment. No suffering will be created, and we're undermining avijja by bringing up vicca, knowledge and vision based on mindfulness, insight, discernment. So it's mindfulness and discernment is what will gradually erode away the hindrances and the avijja. So we have to practice that a lot, develop that a lot. So it's not a bad question. It's a very appropriate question, I think. And the Buddha's way out of this is to cultivate the qualities of mind that we develop in the path, Eightfold Noble Path, particularly mindfulness, discernment, insight, to keep countering the effects of avijja, to keep countering craving and attachment, which are conditioned over and over again throughout our day. You don't have to wait long. You wait a few moments and more craving will be arising in one form or another. That's where you have to practice. So it's a good question. There's a lot of questions, maybe time for one more. Dear Ajahn, I enjoy retreats very much, but occasionally during a sit, even without any actual bodily pain, I would suddenly feel that the sitting feels incredibly unbearable, and I feel like ending my sitting immediately. Otherwise, I feel like I'll go crazy. Usually I try to accept the feeling of unbearableness and try to relax. This only lasts for a few seconds before I exit the sit abruptly and have to breathe deeply to slowly regain composure. Ajahn, could you advise what I can do in this situation? Well, you seem to be describing what's going on quite well, and you understand that you need to be patient and relaxed with the mental states or the painful feelings that are arising. This is why the Buddha said patience is the supreme destroyer of defilement. So number one, be patient with however you feel, whether it's at the beginning of a meditation session or at the end, doesn't matter. Practice patience. And I would say many meditators have found if at the moment during a period of meditation, sitting or walking, you get the desire to stop. So it may be based on how you feel. You may be feeling awful, physically tired, worn out, mentally tired, mentally disturbed in one way or another, and you're finding it difficult, and then you have the thought, I can't do this anymore, I'm going to stop. It's a very common situation. But many meditators have found if they have that, they've reached that point where they just feel they can't carry on with the meditation, but then they introduce the idea, okay, that's just a thought, it's just a desire, but I'm not going to follow it. And so they carry on, because if you have the desire to stop but you don't follow it, it means you carry on. And they see that thought drop away because they're not engaging it, indulging it. Many people find they get a really good insight at that point. It's like it pushes the mind to a point where you just want to give up, but then you say, but that's just a thought, the thought to give up, and you don't follow it. So of course it requires patience, effort, and you may feel uncomfortable in yourself, understandably, but you keep practicing with it, bringing up the mindfulness, being patient with it, until the whole cycle of thought that says, I want to stop, I want to give up, fades away from your experience. Quite often people find they get a radiant peace at that point. Not always, sure, but many people have found that their mind goes to a different depth of peace because they've given up that very desire to end the meditation. It's like their mind becomes a bit more courageous, bolder, stronger. Because it's like, oh, even that thought can't budge me from my intention to keep bringing up mindfulness, putting effort into this meditation. Sometimes at that point you need to think of something that will bring you a bit of extra effort. You think of teachers, the Buddha, or something that inspires you, that can help. Sometimes it's just pure endurance and patience. But it's also the understanding that what is prompting you is still just another sankhara, it's not another temporary, impermanent state of mind, the desire to stop. If I don't follow it, so what? It's just a thought, it's just a desire. It will arise, it will pass away. And your mind goes to a stronger place, a place where it's stronger. The mindfulness becomes strengthened, and often you get good insights, good experiences after that. So I try and catch yourself at that moment and work with that. I sympathize, you may have difficulties in your practice, but everyone does, it's quite normal. And we have to work with this mind. We can't always just give in to every desire to stop, distraction, whatever. Anyway, time is up. There's more questions. We can answer them tomorrow.